Hey, it's Jordan. I'm delighted to be joined by Alisa Lynn Valdés, a novelist and award-winning journalist. Your work has been featured across the board: Boston Globe, Los Angeles Times, The Guardian. And you put out a really interesting and I think powerful tweet thread ahead of the Oppenheimer premiere, which has been getting a lot of buzz, directed by Christopher Nolan, premiering today. And the movie, from what I could tell, really focuses on Oppenheimer, the scientist, his kind of interpersonal fury, and being obviously tormented at his atomic bomb creation. But I'm pretty sure it does not focus on what you revealed. I'm just going to read a little bit of your thread before asking you the first question. This quote from the New York Times review of Oppenheimer, quote, "He served as director of a clandestine weapons lab built in a near desolate stretch of Los Alamos in New Mexico. It was inhabited by Hispanos. They were given less than 24 hours to leave, their farms bulldozed. Many of those families had been on the same land for centuries. The Oppenheimer's crew literally shot all their livestock through the head and bulldozed them. People fled on foot with nowhere to go, land rich, money poor, their land seized by the government." I'll put this tweet thread in the description. I encourage everyone to read through it. But I wanted to start there because what I was under the impression of, and I'm sure most kind of know a little bit about it, that this was a secret lab in a deserted area in Los Alamos. But what you revealed and have been fighting to get the truth at for upwards of 20 years, this was not so deserted, and people were forced off their land and butchered, basically.
Yeah, they were. So here in New Mexico, at this point in time, half the population is what the U.S. Census would call Hispanic, Latino. They self-identify. We self-identify here primarily by Hispano. That's the word they've used for centuries. So I think people need to understand that this is not an immigrant population we're talking about. These are people who've been here since the 16th, sometimes the 15th century. And they identify as Spanish. Most of them are a mix of Native and Spanish, because the Spaniards didn't bring a lot of women with them. So yeah, there were families living there, families that had farms and ranches in that area. And at the time, the US government, did not think much of them. In fact, when they tested the first nuclear bomb, they tested it on New Mexico as well. They detonated the first nuclear bomb here. And a friend of mine who I talk about in that thread, whose name is Loida Martinez, she has shown me documents from her time working at the lab. She worked there for 30 some years, where the internal conversations that were happening about where to test this, pretty much decided it would be fine to test it here without telling anybody, because it was nothing but cows and Mexicans out there. That is how our communities were viewed at that time by the Manhattan Project scientists. So some of the land that they took was federal land. Some of it was a ranch that was owned by Anglos, whites. And then some of it was this private farm ranch land that was owned by Hispanos and their families for centuries. They paid the white landowners about $275 an acre. When they paid the Hispanos, which they said they would do and did not actually do a lot of the time, they gave them $7 an acre. Wow. And they gave Loida's family and others less than 24 hours to leave their land that they'd been on for centuries. This was a way of life back then that was not money-based. These were subsistence farmers. They were living off of their land, as they had done, their Spanish ancestors had done since the 1500s, and their Native ancestors had done for 10,000 years before that. So there were also Native American people who were removed from this land, and people who identified as Hispano.
And also, adding insult to injury, correct me if I'm wrong, particularly the men who were forced off their land, it's not like they had many other opportunities to, make a living. So they were basically forced to then come work for the lab and be exposed, among other toxic elements of obviously an atomic bomb, to beryllium. And they were not provided proper protective gear.
Correct.
However, the whites were. Can you talk about that?
Yes. I learned about all of this because I was approached by Loida Martinez at one of my book signings, and she told me her story, and I'm like, this is incredible. She's filed 2 class action lawsuits against the labs, and she's won both of them. And the first one was on behalf of her father. Her father was one of those men the family lost their land. This is a rural area, okay? So it's not like they can just pick up and go live in Santa Fe and Albuquerque were barely even cities then too. So these are people who suddenly have nothing. By the way, if they didn't get their livestock off the land by the deadline, what happened, and there are photos of this, the US government came in and shot their livestock in the head and then bulldozed them into the ground. So there are these people just standing there watching this happen. Nobody really knew what they would be building there yet. They just knew they couldn't live on their land anymore. So many of the men, then you're destitute. You're like absolutely destitute, you're homeless, no means to survive. So the men wanting to work, and some of the women went to the labs, and the labs happily hired my friend Loida's father. This is not ancient history either. For young people, it probably seems like it. Loida is my friend. She's my age, so we're a little bit older than me. We're talking about people who are still alive, except for her dad. They hired her father and a lot of the men from that area to work at the labs and put them to work with toxic chemicals, in particular beryllium. Loida has photos. I was trying to find copies of them to be able to show you. I couldn't this morning, but she has photos of her dad and other Hispano men standing around vats of beryllium, and their white supervisors are there in complete moon suits. But the Hispano men were not provided with any kind of PPE at all. And what ends up happening is the entire population, male population, working age, who worked there, Hispano, ended up getting berylliosis, including Loida's dad, and that is what killed him. So she then, not really understanding all the pieces as a kid.
I just want to tell the audience so they know, beryllium is one of the most toxic elements in the periodic table. It's responsible, I'm just reading from online, often fatal lung disease, chronic beryllium disease. So it's really, 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 really toxic. Hence
and they knew that.
White people. Yeah.
And they knew that, which is why if Robert Oppenheimer were going to be in that room, he would be in a full protective suit. But they did not care about the people whose land they took, whose farms they bulldozed, whose animals they killed, who they put to work for pennies. And then this whole generation of men from that area died of berylliosis. So Loida was in grade school. She finishes high school and in Chimayo, New Mexico, and goes to work for the labs as a secretary. That's the only job you really can get up there. You work for the labs. There's really nothing else. And they quickly realized that she was extremely bright, and they had a hiring freeze, and they needed computer scientists. So they put Loida through college and through a master's in computer science. She became some sort of a systems, manager, computer systems, and rose to head a whole department at the labs. So it's been funny to get some of the feedback. They're like, you're just radical. I'm like, Loida is hardly radical. This is a woman who was a computer scientist for the Los Alamos National Labs. But once she was inside the labs, she started putting pieces together of what had actually happened. She didn't really know. And she remembered her dad working, and she started looking into the documents, and she found these photos and this evidence of what had happened to her dad and all these other men. She's like, this finally makes sense. They knew, and they let this happen because of their race, or perceived race. So she filed a class action lawsuit and won. And so what's frustrating for me, I'm sure the Oppenheimer story is interesting. I'm sure he's an interesting person. It's just an incomplete story. And it's sort of a it's a fictionalized story. It's a biopic. But as very often happens in our society, biopics become truth. And even non-biopics become truth. The John Wayne West is sort of an idea that people think was real. That was never real. That is not how this place worked. And that's not, but that's what we think.
Right.
Story is very powerful. And I've been trying, I optioned Loida's life story way back then. And I've been trying to get attention for a film about her. I think she's very much like an Erin Brockovich type of character. But it was even more profound than that, because this is also a giant, the allegory and the symbolism of what it means. By the way, that part of the country is so interesting, because Los Alamos County, Los Alamos National Labs, that city has more PhDs and patents per capita than any other place in the United States. It has more millionaires per capita too, because of that. The annual defense budget that is spent on making nuclear weapons in New Mexico is more than $9 billion. Our state's entire economy, aside from that, is less than that. It's 8.4. Wow. So there's more money being spent here on making these weapons. But the county right next door, which is Rio Arriba County, which is where Chimayo is. Chimayo is one of these pilgrimage sites that Catholics go to all over the world, because it has this santuario that has this sacred dirt. People eat the dirt, and it's just this kind of mystical place. Rio Arriba County was the poorest county in the nation. It's something like the second or third maybe now. So here you have, side by side right now, the richest, most patented, most highly educated county in the country, next to perhaps the poorest. Rio Arriba County is number one for heroin overdose deaths, for all of the kinds of addiction and problems that come with trauma, generational trauma, and also the trauma of imposed poverty. It's also the lowrider capital of the country. It's a really interesting area. This Española right next door is. But so that's why I found her story so interesting. It just seems like a microcosm of so many things about the United States, and about who gets money and why they get it, and who gets displaced for that to happen, who's valued as a human and who is not.
And I'd like to zero in on one part, because I think you had mentioned there was really no advance notice given. I mean, I just read this this morning, and it's really harrowing. Downwind of Trinity. And it's a story about some schoolgirls at 5:30 a.m. on July 16th, 1945. 13-year-old Barbara Kent was on a camping trip with her dance teacher and 11 other students in Ruidoso, New Mexico, when a forceful blast threw her out of her bunk bed onto the floor. Later that day, the girls noticed what they believed was snow falling outside. Surprised and excited, Kent recalls the young dancers ran outside to play. Quote, "We all thought, oh my gosh, it's July and it's snowing. Yet it was real warm. We put it on our hands and we're rubbing it on our face. We were all having such a good time trying to catch what we thought was snow." Years later, Kent learned that quote, snow the young students played in was actually fallout from the first nuclear test explosion in the US, known as Trinity. Of the 12 girls that attended the camp, Kent is the only living survivor. The other 11 died from various cancers, as did the camp dance teacher, and Kent's mother, who was staying nearby, diagnosed with 4 different types of cancers herself. Kent is one of many people in New Mexico unknowingly exposed to fallout from the explosion of the first atomic bomb. I mean,
so I don't know if you saw my tweet before the one that you posted. My mom is one of those people. Okay. So yeah, so that's separate from the Loida story. My mother, we have 11 generations in this state on my mom's side of the family. And my mom grew up in a town called Bosque, New Mexico, which is tiny. And it's 87 miles from ground zero of Trinity. She was 18 months old when they detonated that bomb. And they detonated it in the summer, which is monsoon season here. And that day, there were a lot of monsoon clouds. And the weather patterns took the mushroom cloud over my mother's town and county, and it rained. And my mom of the 21 girls in her graduating high school class, 17 had leukemia. My mother is still alive. She's 79 now, but she's had thyroid cancer, which when she got it, they said this is the only time we see this type of thyroid cancer is after extremely high doses of radiation. And just a few years ago, I noticed she was slurring her speech, and I was like, you need to go. And I took her to the ER, and they found a brain tumor the size of an orange in her left frontal lobe that they think had been growing for decades. And that was a kind of tumor that is also associated with high doses of radiation. Her grandfather was a sheep rancher in a town called Mountain Air, which is even closer to Trinity. And she remembers him saying he thought the sun came up twice that day. And he was quite confused by it. So he was out there. And what's funny is my mom's family is very conservative. They're all like super patriotic, super conservative. In my mom's case, the government did something else too during that time period. And the Albuquerque Journal won a Pulitzer Prize for writing about this particular chapter. My mom was in a grade school in a town called Belen. The people in Los Alamos didn't know what the effects of radiation were on people. So they decided to test radiated orange juice on New Mexico school children. So my mother's patriotic family, Republican, like super right-wing family, were asked to sign off on these waivers for nutritional research, and they did. And my mom, for a year, maybe 2 years, I don't know, when she was in grade school, a nurse would come in with pails of radiated orange juice and give it to all of the kids. So not only were they in the fallout zone from this, they were also deliberately fed radiated orange juice. And the documents are very clear. They would not have done this in wealthy white areas. They did this in poor Hispano rural areas because we were subhuman to them.
And basically, I guess in their twisted, twisted logic, this was an acceptable sacrifice as part of the nuclear arms race to kind of, quote, save millions more. That's what you hear from. We had to drop the bomb to save the world, things like that. But this was a sacrifice zone.
On Twitter, even there's this flood of people being like, "Well, you're sorry about your mom, but would you rather be speaking German?" Like, thank you for having absolutely no capacity for nuance, empathy, compassion. It's not an either or necessarily. All of these, there's this coping mechanism in psychology called splitting that happens with toddlers, where you can't see your parent as a good person who's done something you don't like. So you create two parents in your mind. There's good mommy and there's bad mommy. And people with personality disorders grow up still doing that. I feel like our whole society is doing that now. It's like, yeah, you can have a tormented man who was at a crossroads and built this thing, and there was good science being done, and maybe their intentions were noble, Einstein's intents, all of them. But that can coexist with horrendous things that were done to our own citizens. Now, I'm not saying it's better to do it to people somewhere else. It's not. But I do think it's important to include the reality of what the United States government did to its own people in a state that at the time had only been a state for about 30 years. Had been a territory, like Puerto Rico is a territory now, for much, much longer. And by the way, the US government was testing weapons out on the island of Vieques in Puerto Rico. Until very recently, they've still been doing this to Puerto Rico. So it's kind of like, it's part of a larger erasure that happens in the US when it comes to Latino people generally. The story that is told of who we are is very unidimensional and inaccurate, and tends to be Latinos conflated with immigrant is conflated with illegal. There's just this criminality and non-belonging that undergirds almost every story that's told about us. And that includes erasing the fact that, huge portions of the US were Mexico, were Spain. The names of the states indicate that: Colorado, Nevada, Montana, California, Arizona. These are Spanish words. Los Angeles. So yeah, it's just this weird, I can't really explain it, why that's being done.
And also, I think we would probably, if this happened in Iraq or elsewhere, people like you and I would call it a war crime. And a lot of people.
100%. My dad is from the nation of Cuba. All right. So his family left Cuba in 1961. The U.S. has had an economic embargo against Cuba for human rights abuses almost that entire time that has strangled, the Cuban people. And one of the justifications that's given for that embargo is that the communists, when they came in, took over the property of all of these people, right? But that's exactly what they did at Los Alamos. So it's kind of like it's a heroic thing for us to do in the name of patriotism and America, but this is a horrible thing when somebody else does it. It's all hypocritical and strange. And yes, it would definitely be called a war crime. I don't think with few exceptions, a few sociopaths on the internet, I think there are very few people who would say, I am glad we nuked your mom when she was 18 months old and caused all of these health problems for her and for us. Right. Her brain tumor destroyed our family. We didn't know why her personality changed. When you have brain injury in that part of your brain, you lose, you lose your filter. It causes certain kinds of behaviors that made our family fall apart. And that had, generational trauma repercussions for me, for my son, she became very, very mean. And it wasn't until that tumor was taken out that, and I was in the recovery room when she woke up, it was the first time in decades my mom looked at me and said, I love you. Wow. Like she had just become brutal, but it was the tumor. It's like a bad telenovela plot. You're like, well, I don't know why she's been this hard. Well, it's a tumor, but it was a tumor. And that tumor was given to her when radiation rained down on her and her patriotic, Republican family in rural New Mexico.
But a kid can't understand that. So obviously it affects you very negatively.
We didn't know. I mean, now I've gone through a whole thing where I forgive her. We're very good friends again. She's written a beautiful poem. My mom's a writer about her tumor and Trinity and the sun rising twice and all of those things. I just would like her story to be heard. I'd like Loida's story to be heard.
That was my next question, because as a journalist, I mean, to a much lesser degree, I have fought to get the true story of Flint out there, which frankly, mainstream media doesn't care about anymore. Book publishers don't care about. And you have been fighting to get Loida Martinez's story out. But pretty much in today's Hollywood, now streaming dynamic, it's typically the biopic or major motion picture of, the conflicted white man, in this case, Oppenheimer, with, the attractive movie star, and Christopher Nolan's the director. And I'm sure it's an interesting film. But can you kind of talk about, there's a race element here, clearly, because to me, it's equally, if not more, interesting and important to get the story about the sacrificial lambs, which were the Hispanos you're talking about, than Oppenheimer and, him later on being tormented by what he created. But thus far, there hasn't been much of an appetite for that story.
No, not for that one. And not for, there's another huge crime committed against Hispanic, Latino citizens in the U.S., which was during Herbert Hoover's administration, the Great Depression. They scapegoated what they called Mexicans back then. And Hoover created something called the Mexican Repatriation Act. You can't repatriate someone to a nation they've never been to, but they forcibly removed more than 1 million people from the United States to Mexico on trains, took their belongings, cleared out their bank accounts, everything. The majority of those people were US citizens who had names like mine, who looked Mexican to that. They didn't care. And my son's paternal great-grandfather was one of those people removed when he was 10 in this mass exodus. And the US government knew perfectly well he was a citizen, because when he turned 18, they tried to draft him in Mexico. But I wrote a book proposal about this. There's only one book that I can find about this. It's a small academic book that still refers to it as the Mexican Repatriation Act and talks about repatriation. It's not repatriation. What it is, when you take citizens of your own country and force them to leave the country to go somewhere else based on their ethnicity or race, that fits the international definition of a genocide. We talk about the Japanese internment camps. The Mexican Repatriation Act affected 10 times as many people, and no one knows about it, and no publisher would touch it 2 years ago. And the reason I was given over and over again was the Mexican issue is still too contentious. So there's still this scapegoating and hatred of Mexicans, and by association, all Latinos in the United States, this ongoing sense that we don't really belong here. Even if we're born here, even if we've been here since 1589, this is not really our country. Asian American, African American have American built into the word that is used to describe them. We do not. We remain seen, those groups are tolerated, but by racists is like, yeah, they're here, we're not happy about it. But my group is seen as interlopers, foreigners, no matter how long we've been here. Our history here doesn't matter. It gets erased over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, obviously there's the physical health, just staggering cancer rates, among other things we've talked about in the area. And this went far and wide. You were talking about the weather pattern, et cetera. But can you kind of talk about, I've covered Native American issues, and there's generational trauma to what they've been through that forever changes the culture. It's passed down to child, to grandchild. Can you kind of talk about, you talked about your own family, but the wider area where so many people were affected. How is this affecting people even to this day?
When you look at New Mexico, statistics about New Mexico generally, we are always in competition with Mississippi to be the poorest state in the union. We are number one, tied with Arizona for early childhood, adverse childhood experiences or early childhood trauma and abuse. We are the least literate state. We have, the highest rates of all the things you don't want, like people dying when meth labs explode, or not graduating from high school. All of these kinds of social ills that you see here, I'm not blaming them all on the Manhattan Project. This is a state that has a long, sad history of multiple colonizations. And, it's interesting to kind of talk about the Hispanos and how victimized they are, and it's legitimate. But if you go back far enough, the ancestors that some of them are the most proud of, including my own, I trace my family tree back to a guy named Juan de Alba de Tenorio, who was actually sent to New Mexico to commit genocide against the Cochiti Pueblo. That's my ancestor. I am not proud of that. There's a lot of nuance, and there was also a lot of, it's not black and white, like it's not simple. The Spaniards intermarried with native people, and on customs mixed, and people, genetic testing shows very clearly now that most of the people who consider themselves 100% Spanish in New Mexico are indigenous. So there's a lot of that. And I don't know what the solution is. Our governor, I think, Michelle Lujan Grisham, is really great. She's done some amazing work trying to address this. We are the first state to have free college now because of her in the last couple of years. Free early childhood education, I think from age 3 or 4 up. Early childhood education and free child care. So she's starting to make inroads. I think, free lunch and school lunch and breakfast for all students in New Mexico, regardless of income. And she's getting a lot of pushback for all of these things that are, addressing the sort of systemic poverty and cycles of poverty. But that's where we are. We're a large state, the 5th largest state in the union, with a very small population, 2.2 million people, I think, spread out over these vast, spaces. So in a lot of New Mexico, you still don't have internet, electricity, running water. Most of our roads are dirt roads. We have paved roads in the cities, but outside of the cities, it's dirt. So I think it's a beautiful place. This place is stunning geographically. And it's got some amazing cultural aspects that make me love it and not want to leave again. But economically and socially, we are really struggling here.
Mm-hmm. And one more question. I assume not, but has there ever been any federal government overtures as far as reparations, any type of resources for those sick? I mean, you see these Camp Lejeune commercials constantly, and good, but I very much doubt whether it's been Republicans or Democrat presidents that they have done much to, provide resources to those sickened.
There's a huge push for it now. There's an amazing woman named Tina Cordova who heads the Downwinders organization, and her family, that's what they call people like my mom who were in the fallout zone, the Downwinders. She's been fighting for reparations for a really long time. And it's only in the last couple of years that we've started to see lawmakers like Martin Heinrich, listening, paying attention, and trying to get that ball moving. But I think at this point, they're talking about giving people like my mom 50 grand, for a lifetime. She was unable to work. The family fell apart. This was extraordinarily expensive to our family and our communities generally. So I'm not sure where that's at. It's kind of in flux right now. I know year before last, Tina was actually getting heard in Washington at hearings and getting support. Whereas in decades past, when she did it, it was kind of like, get out of here, Right. Yeah. So I'm hoping that tide is changing. And given the incredible response, I did not expect that tweet to go viral at all. I just really thought it was like my own little oh, here we go, Oppenheimer, yay, my mom's tumor, cool. I think there is a general feeling across the board probably that wrongs were done to our own citizens and something should be done to acknowledge that.
Yeah. And I think what your tweet, and hopefully you have a long line now, if there is a God, for a book and a film, but I think what it reveals is so much of the talk about the military-industrial complex talks about the havoc and terror we reign across the globe. But I think it's revealing that we really don't know who we victimized here in the name of, saving the world, which was the Manhattan Project.
I see it as similar to, the Tuskegee Airmen story. Like, you can have a noble military that also is in some ways doing horrible things. Like, it doesn't have to be a black or white story. And that is not the story that I'm trying to tell. It's just a full story, an honest story. My mother is like one of the most patriotic people you'd ever meet. And sometimes she's very Catholic. She's doesn't want to rock the boat. Oh, I don't want to be a bother. I don't want to be trouble. That's very typical of the people who suffered from that time period and in this place. There's a fatalism to the culture here that I think is rooted probably in Mexico and Spain, but also when you are a farming community in the desert, there's this incredible strength and tolerance for hardship, where you're just like, well, we're going to wait this out. So there hasn't been a great fighting spirit. People have not wanted, if there are people in the United States who are thinking, oh, well, they just dropped that on a bunch of radicalized, Chicano power people or immigrants who hate America, like whatever crazy right-wing people think. that could not be further from the truth. Most of the rural Hispano people here are conservative, or even if they're Democrats, they're very middle of the road. Many of them have served in the military. Many of them work for the labs. It's not, they victimized their own biggest supporters. That's what's so sad about it.
Right. Thank you so much, Alisa Lynn Valdés. I will put your tweet thread in the description. I encourage everyone to read into this more. And thank you for giving us the actual history, which, like many other things, we don't really learn in grade school. So
thanks
thank you so much.
Sharing. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.